For years, Samuel had worked the night shift in a towering corporate building downtown. His uniform was plain, his tools simple: a mop, a cart, a ring of keys that opened doors no one else cared about. To most executives, he was background noise, a shadow slipping quietly through offices after the lights dimmed. But Samuel paid attention. He noticed the smallest details, whether it was a flickering bulb, a dripping faucet, or the tension in someone's voice as they rushed past him in the halls. The CEO of the company, Richard Hale, was the kind of man who seemed untouchable. A millionaire several times over, he commanded boardrooms with a voice that carried power. To the staff, he was a figure on the top floor, too distant to be real. Yet Samuel often saw him in passing late nights when the office was nearly empty. Richard still hunched over glowing screens, his tie loosened but determination etched across his face. It was on one of those nights that Samuel's sharp eye caught something unusual, a stumble so small most would have dismissed it as fatigue. A hand pressed briefly against the wall for balance. The CEO shook it off quickly, muttering something under his breath before disappearing into his office. Others would have ignored it, assuming it was nothing. But Samuel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, his decision to pay attention was about to draw him into a situation far bigger than a janitor's quiet routine. Samuel carried on with his duties, yet his mind kept circling back to what he had seen. Richard Hale, the man whose name carried weight in newspapers and television interviews, had seemed fragile. It wasn't the picture of strength the world admired. Samuel knew exhaustion when he saw it. He had lived with it for decades, but this was different. There was a heaviness in the CEO's movements, a pallor in his face that no amount of coffee could explain. Over the next week, Samuel noticed more. Late in the evenings, as he emptied trash bins and wiped down glass walls, he saw Richard pause more often than usual. Sometimes he would grip the edge of his desk, steadying himself as if the room had shifted beneath him. Once Samuel caught him sitting with his head in his hands, breathing unevenly, before snapping back into his confident persona the second someone entered the room. No one seemed to notice, or worse, no one cared. The assistants were too busy juggling calls and meetings. The executives were too focused on climbing the ladder. To them, Richard was indestructible, and acknowledging weakness was inconvenient. Samuel, however, had no ladder to climb, no reputation to guard. He had nothing but his instincts, and those instincts told him something was dangerously wrong. One night, long past the hour most had gone home, Samuel heard a thud echo from the CEO's office. His heart leapt. He abandoned his cart and rushed toward the sound. Through the glass walls, he saw Richard slumped in his chair, one hand clutching at his chest, his complexion drained of color. For a moment, Samuel froze. He was just the janitor, the man invisible in these polished corridors. Would anyone even believe him if he raised the alarm? Seconds stretched into eternity, and with them came the weight of a decision. Walk away, and no one would ever know he had been there. Act, and he risked stepping into a role no one had ever expected him to play. His hands trembled, but Samuel chose. He burst into the office, calling out Richard's name. There was no response, just a strained gasp. Samuel remembered the first aid training he'd taken years ago at the community center, a requirement he had once thought unnecessary. But now every detail of that training came flooding back. What to do when the signs of a heart attack appeared, how to keep a man alive until help arrived. With steady urgency, Samuel grabbed the phone on Richard's desk and dialed emergency services, his voice firm despite the storm raging in his chest. Then he moved back to Richard's side, checking his breathing, loosening his tie, and positioning him to keep his airway open. The CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, the man who commanded boardrooms, was helpless in the arms of a janitor no one acknowledged. Outside the office, the building remained silent, unaware that within those walls a battle between life and death had already begun. The paramedics were on their way, but to Samuel every second felt like an eternity. Richard's breaths grew shallow, his skin slick with sweat. The powerful man who once towered over stockholders and investors now seemed small, fragile, his life hanging in the balance. Samuel knelt beside him, whispering reassurances the CEO could barely hear. He remembered the signs: tightness in the chest, shortness of breath, weakness spreading across the body. It was all there. Richard tried to speak, his lips forming broken words, but no sound came. His hand slipped from Samuel's grasp and his head tilted back. Panic clawed at Samuel's chest, but he forced it down. Now was not the time for fear. He started chest compressions, counting steadily under his breath, every push a desperate plea against fate. The room echoed with the sound of his effort, his palms pressing into the chest of a man who had seemed untouchable until now. Sweat ran down Samuel's face, his arms aching, but he didn't stop. This was no longer about social divides, about who was rich and who was invisible. It was about life, about refusing to let another human being slip away. At last, a faint gasp shuddered through Richard's chest. Relief flooded Samuel, but the battle wasn't over. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. He pressed on, urging Richard to hold on just a little longer. Then the doors burst open and uniformed medics rushed in, their equipment clattering as they took over. One of them looked at Samuel with a nod of respect, recognizing immediately that his intervention had made the difference. Samuel stepped back, trembling, his hands red from effort, his body exhausted. He had been the only one to see, the only one to act, and because of that, the CEO still had a chance at life. In those tense moments, as Richard was lifted onto a stretcher, Samuel realized the truth. Sometimes the person the world ignores is the one who saves it. The next morning, the building buzzed with whispers. News spread quickly. The CEO had suffered a near-fatal heart attack, but survived. Few knew the truth of what had happened in that dimly lit office, and fewer still could imagine who had stood at the center of it. For years, Samuel had passed unnoticed through those same corridors, his presence acknowledged only by the squeak of a mop or the clang of a bucket. But now, behind hushed voices and curious stares, the story emerged. Executives who once brushed past him learned that it was Samuel, the janitor, the man they barely saw, who had recognized the danger when no one else did. He had acted when others ignored the signs, saving the very leader they all depended on. Some looked at him with newfound respect, others with quiet shame. But Samuel himself did not seek glory. He had not acted for recognition, nor to prove anyone wrong. He had acted because he cared. Richard Hale, recovering in the hospital, sent word personally. He wanted to thank the man who had given him a second chance at life. For the first time, Samuel was called not to fix a spill or sweep a floor, but to stand as the quiet hero he had always been. Yet beyond the headlines and handshakes, one truth remained. Samuel's story was not just about saving a CEO. It was about how easily we ignore those we think unimportant, how quickly we overlook the humanity in the people who serve us every day. In the end, it was not wealth, power, or status that made the difference. It was the eyes of a man the world refused to see. And so the question lingers, how many lives are waiting to be saved if only we stopped ignoring the people right in front of us?